Good morning. Well, it's morning as of this recording. My name is Wesley Lawton, and I'm one of the facilitators of the Men Overcoming Loss Grief Support Group, which takes place virtually on the first and third Tuesdays of each month at 6 p.m. First Tuesday group is generally more of a discussion-based, less structured kind of a group where the gentlemen who join the group just sort of share what's going on in their lives at the time and support one another in more organic conversation. The facilitators might have a topic sort of in their back pocket to bring up if necessary, but in our group, it doesn't seem to really be necessary very often, but it's there. The third Tuesday group is generally more of an education focused group. There's usually a presentation, and the first 40 to 45 minutes is focused on that material with some involvement from the participants. And then the last 20 or 30 minutes or so is kind of discussing that topic, the content of the presentation. Some other things may come up, but that's generally how it goes. This month here in September, the third Tuesday group was a little bit different. It was more of a continuation of the first Tuesday group of September. And in that group, I guess in both groups this month, it was sort of a semi-structured conversation. One of our other facilitators, Will Gasper, came across a great article by a guy named Phil Zilla, and it's about grieving men. And the article is a sort of academic style article, and it's an essay. It focuses on the writings of, I believe it's 4 different authors who are all theologians, but it's from their personal writings about their own losses and grief experiences. And so these authors are, of course, very eloquent, very effective at expressing themselves, their thoughts and their feelings, very honest, or, at least as much as we can tell in their writings. And so it's a very in-depth sort of case study of these men who are grieving. And he also brings in other literature that supports or speaks to what the authors write about. And the author of the article identifies specific things that these men, and that the research shows most men seem to go through when they grieve, and some of the ways that it might differ from the ways that women tend to grieve. And towards the end, he talks about in the article, basically what can we do with this information? What are some things that can help? And so we've been working through this, not word for word, not as a book study or an article study specifically, but using it as a structure for conversation and asking the guys in the group, what's your experience with this? And would you put it this way, or would you put it another way? And so it's worked out pretty well for us the last couple of times. And we didn't get that far into the article. I should say, now that we're 2 meetings into it, we're about halfway through, I would say. And I think that's a good sign that we're working through it slowly, because a lot of things have come up with the guys in the group from this article. And so I expect that we'll continue it into October, at least for the first Tuesday group, if not the third one again. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. And once we work our way through the article, we'll get back into our regular format, I'm thinking. So it's a little bit of introduction into what this video is about. This video is just a summary of what took place in last Tuesday's group. Let's see, that would be the 21st is when the group took place. And so really we only focused especially on 2 sections of the article, and got a little bit into the third one, just sort of introducing it so that it could be picked up in October. So I'll share with you some parts of the article, some of the thoughts of the guys in the group, as well as some of my own. And that's going to be basically the structure of this video. And I hope that you benefit from it and connect with it. So the first section here, and I won't even share my screen necessarily, but the first section is about sadness. And this is where the author of the article is identifying specific things that men go through. And of course, basically everybody, regardless of their gender, experiences sadness on some level when they lose somebody they care about. But he talks specifically about how the authors of the books that he's pulling from for the article experience sadness and how it might speak to how men in general tend to grieve. So this section is pretty short. It's just each section of the different aspects of grief here starts with some quotes from the books and then has some notes, some thoughts afterward. And so this one just has 5 short quotes and then a paragraph. So I read the whole thing in group. I'll read the whole thing here now as well. The section on sadness. And so it starts with these quotes from the books. How am I to sing in this desolate land? Is there not broken music? I suddenly felt a deep inner sadness. Sorrow is an unwelcome companion. Tonight, all the hells of young grief have opened again. The emotion of sadness is an important indicator in grief. However, the experiences of sadness indicated here are, with one exception, quite subdued, quiet, inner, and soft. Wolsterstoff filled with aching sadness refers to the broken music. If there is any chance he can sing again, it will be desolate, a desolate broken song. How else could it be with such a loss? Nouwen was awakened by his inner sadness. It came over him suddenly and unexpectedly in the most ordinary moment. He expected his mother to be there at the front door to hear his stories and to keep track of his successes as she had always done. Not this time. Now he and his father would be left without her consolations, and they would have to settle for their unwelcome companion, sorrow. One of the only deeply emotional outbursts of sadness in these accounts is Lewis's hells of young grief that burst out at a time when he is expecting life to get back to normal. So some observations and thoughts that came up from this section. You know, the guys in the group really connected with this emotion and with this part of the discussion. They shared about their own experiences of sadness and I appreciated how raw they were with their the things that they've been going through and how intense and sort of hopeless they've felt in their sadnesses. And David, the other facilitator in this Third Thursday group regularly, shared about how his perspective, and I tend to agree with him here, is that the author of the article gets it a little bit off. It sounded like maybe David had read this book or this passage of the book from Wolsterstorff, I'm sorry, is the author of the book that the quote is from, about broken music. And David described about how the concept of having music that is broken is actually not quiet or subdued. It's very grating and disturbing and perhaps very loud, unsettling. Again, not really words that are connected so much with quiet and subdued. And one of the guys really identified with Lewis's quote, tonight all the hells of young grief have opened again, just about a major grief burst. And this is something that everybody who's grieving the loss of somebody very close to them tends to experience, is that even as time goes by, the sadness, the intensity of the sadness and the emotional pain tends to decrease over time, sort of ups and downs, but generally decreasing. But then once in a while, often it's triggered by a special day, or it could be a song or a smell or something someone says, or it could seem to come out of the blue. It's just the way that your mind might be processing subconsciously, but you get sort of a tidal wave of grief wash over you. And that's that sort of the hells of young grief that Lewis describes and experienced and wrote about. And it's something that, again, most of the guys had already been through, having worked their way through grief over a number of months, and in some cases over a year, but they still get those huge tidal waves of grief at times, and that's a normal thing. It's not pleasant. It's not, I wouldn't say it's no big deal, but it is normal and it does pass. Let's see what else came from this. Um, the guys throughout the group really referred to the sadness as the unwelcome companion sorrow. They really connected with that quote as well. Um, just that it's something, it almost is like a person who is with you and you don't want them to be with you, but they won't go away. Um, so really, as we were talking about sadness, the guys started moving into discussing the next topic without knowing what it was going to be. And that topic was despair. The guys were talking about, at least the way that I would describe despair, they were talking about how hopeless their futures looked, how just really pessimistic they were about the rest of their lives, about how, the feeling that they were going to need to sort of carry their grief, their sorrow, their sadness on their backs for the rest of their lives, very similarly to how it was right now, weeks or months into their grief journeys. Talked about how, in some cases, how old they were and some physical limitations they had, mobility limitations. When they look to the future without their dearest loved one, it looks like I'm losing a connection here. I really hope that Zoom doesn't disconnect. Okay, I'm going to keep going. When they thought about losing their loved one, and in this last Tuesday's group, all the guys had lost a spouse. So you can have that for context. Losing their life partners in some cases for many decades. It looked pretty hopeless. It looked like they weren't really ever going to be mostly happy again. And so that feeling of despair and that bleak outlook is pretty understandable in those situations. Whether it's completely rational, whether it is indeed the way that their lives will work out, I'm not so sure that that can be said for certain. But that feeling that they are, the word came up, doomed to live out their lives in this way, that causes them to despair. That feeling and that hopelessness, that despair is understandable. So I'll move into the next section of despair, where we spent some time on Tuesday. And I won't read the whole section here. It's just a little bit longer, maybe about twice as long as the last one. But I'll read the quotes and then some selections from this section. Here are the quotes. What chokes every prayer and every hope is the memory of all the prayers of H, the wife who had died. In other words, praying for that person to get better, and she didn't. And so that chokes his prayers now. The next quote, our worst fears about God are true. I thought I trusted the rope until it mattered to me whether it would bear me. Now it matters, and I find I didn't. The suffering of the world has worked its way inside me. I buried myself that warm June day. Okay, so I'm just looking at trying to figure out exactly which parts to bring up here. He brings up a researcher or a writer of other academic articles, Dennis Class here, and quotes Class or summarizes parts of his writing saying, those who are still mourning the loss of a loved one may experience the quality of their grief changing with time, but they still may not laugh as deeply as others. Again, just looking to the future and thinking, I'll never be as happy as I was then. And then this part jumped out to me as well. Also from Class, a quote from him. If we understand that the continuing sorrow is a form of non-debilitating depression, and if mild depression is a good predictor of the future, then it would seem that the thoughts and feelings in sorrow have truth value. That is, grief's sorrow sees the world rightly. And earlier, Class is quoted saying that he revisits therapeutic bereavement theories that seem biased towards optimism. We have used different labels for less than optimal grief: pathological, unresolved, prolonged, chronic, complicated, and so on. A large portion of the phenomena included in these diagnoses is deep sadness, emptiness, nothingness, or depression, as well as associated behaviors. So, without getting too clinical and academic here, essentially, I interpret that to say that a lot of times, even those of us who have work in supporting people with grief, we sometimes tend to take grief that is a very deep and intense sadness and emotional pain and what some might describe as despair, and we label it as abnormal or as um, you know, clinically problematic, and just basically saying, going back to some of these words: pathological, chronic, complicated, um, just to say, it is sort of brushing on the concept of sort of a mental illness. And class is saying, and quoted in the article, that um, we need to be careful about that, because these feelings are actually a normal part, a normal expression of grief for many people. Um, and they don't necessarily need to be treated as mental illness or something bordering on mental illness. I mean, they need to be taken seriously, but there should be a normalizing there and not a stigmatizing. And so that's important for me and my colleagues to remember. And it's very important for those of you who are going through grief to remember that um, it's okay to have these feelings. It's normal. It's understandable. It's a natural reaction to your loss in many cases, especially if it's somebody who you were very attached to and love very much. So um, I found that to be helpful, perhaps a little biased as a clinician myself here, as somebody in grief support. And again, I liked this quote that grief's sorrow sees the world rightly. That the fact is that in some cases, um, you may not get back to a place where you are quite as happy as you were before. Or I tend to be a little more hopeful and optimistic than that. And I would say that it's never going back to the way that it was. And there are elements of your life that you may never experience again. Um, and yet, there is also the opportunity for a different kind of happiness, of peace, of fulfillment, of even joy in your life. And in some ways, a deeper one, because of this experience of love, of loss, of journeying through grief, and all the things that you learn along the way. Not that I would describe grief and loss as a positive experience, but um, there is a lot of learning and growing, and that's why I like my work. A huge part of it is that I get to witness that, and in some cases be a part of that. It's quite an honor. Um, so I think that there is cause for optimism, at least as a grief support person myself, um, and seeing people's journeys, understanding that the despair and the hopelessness is an important part of grief. It's not something that we should brush over. I shared in the group that I'm always very careful not to just point people toward the silver lining, and as David said, to walk on the sunny side of life. Because I think that most people who go through grief, they get that from people. Often that comes from a place of, I am uncomfortable with how sad you are right now, and so I want to make you feel better. I want to help you understand why your feelings are not rational, so that you don't feel that way, so that I don't have to sit with you in those feelings. That's what I've observed. It is a lot of times with people who are often well-meaning, but fail to support in a way that is helpful. What we need is for people to understand that when we lose somebody we love, um, that the pain is there, the sadness and the depression are there. As class describes, it is right, it is true, and we need to acknowledge that and sit with that and be a witness to that with people who have lost loved ones. If there's going to be any hope for true healing and recovery, and some of that different happiness and joy and fulfillment that I described a little while ago. So anyway, this is getting kind of deep, and I hope that those who have lost a loved one and might be going through this can identify with it. Again, I really want to commend and applaud the guys, if any of you are watching this, who were there in the group, for sharing as honestly and in some cases vulnerably as you did. Just sharing about how bleak it can look when you're when you're in that young grief in particular. And I hope, and I encourage you to have hope. And I think that this hope is not unfounded because, again, I've seen so many stories, I've been a witness to so many stories where this is the case. People who are in that time of despair and they can't imagine being okay or feeling good most of the time. And yet they keep going, and they do. Um, they do. And it's hard to describe. It's complicated. I guess I probably could take, another 20 or 30 minutes and talk about sort of how it all tends to work for people. But I don't know that that would really be helpful for you viewing this video if you're going through grief, or for the guys in our group. I mean, the information only goes so far. It's something that you have to go through and experience in order to really grasp it, or even to believe that it could be true. You just can't see outside of the shroud of grief when you're in the middle of it. It's essentially impossible. I mean, I can say this to you, and I can ask you to trust me as somebody who does this for a living. And so that trust in that that might give you hope that it's not always going to be quite this hard, but that doesn't save you from where you are right now. Okay, let's see here. David and the guys talked about trusting our supports, or in Lewis's case and in many people's case, trusting in God, that God will be there for me. And that can be hard when you expected God to be there for you when your loved one was ill, or in their final hours, their final weeks and months, and the person died anyway. You have to sort of make sense of what to do with that in your whatever relationship with God you might have, or again your supports who might not be there for you in the ways that you expected them to be, and hope that they would be. It's hard. It can be hard to open yourself up to that again, to trust the rope again. Okay, I think that that's enough about the sadness and despair. The last one is about resistance and spirituality. Again, remembering that all these authors who were studied in the article or referred to in the article are theologians, and so this is a part of their lives. I'm convinced that spirituality is or can be, a part of everyone's life, even if it doesn't look religious in the traditional ways. And maybe you disagree with that, and that's understandable. I think there's a case to be made for that, that so many people feel that they don't have a spiritual aspect to their lives. And that's legitimate. And I think that we can still work with that. And you can still have, of course, a meaningful, fulfilling life with that outlook. I'll just share, I think, the quotes from here. It's like a chuckle in the darkness. The sense that some shattering and disarming simplicity is the real answer. I shall try to keep the wound from healing. Mourners are aching visionaries. A new confrontation with death is taking place. Love is stronger than death. And so very briefly, we talked about how these authors, all having a concept of God that they, I guess I would say they like enough to attach a career to it. And I would assume that it's real to each of them, or at least has been real to each of them. And again, they're grappling with this grief can be overwhelming, and this death is so impactful in my life. What do I do with that? How do I justify a belief in a loving, powerful God when this is my reality and when these feelings are so overwhelming to me? And towards the end of this section, it says, these authors are able to live with deep ambiguity and strain. They are able to touch the core of their anxiety and be moved beyond it to something not quite in their grasp. And David, who has some experience in the ministry world, shared about how it's something that comes up in those circles a lot of times, that you need to, and I hope and I believe this is true for many people in ministry, in Christianity or other religions, that you've got to learn to live with attention. And my observation is that that's true of life in general, that there are things where it feels like a paradox, and yet you can find a way to live with it. And that's, again, true for our spiritual lives as well. And this brought to mind to me that sometimes there are people who, when life feels like it's falling apart, such as when you lose a loved one, and your first instinct is to say, it's all okay. I'm going to be fine, one day at a time. We can do this, and sort of holding it together, when that's not how you're actually feeling on the inside. And how what needs to happen there is you need to actually face and be honest with yourself, and with at least one or two others, if not more, about how you're actually feeling. And if it feels like it's falling apart, then you need to sort of let it fall apart and enter into that, as difficult as that is. I understand that's no simple thing. And you work through that, and you sit in that, and it takes months and years, depending on how far along you want to look, and where you consider your healing to be. But once you do that, and you do start to have more good days than bad days, and you do start to feel happiness when you think of your loved one more than you feel that sadness and that missing them, you journey through your grief. And then you can say with honesty some of those things that maybe you tried to say or you wanted to say in the beginning, that it's all going to be okay. And I'm putting one foot in front of the other. I'm living one day at a time. It's getting better. Some of these things that you put up as a facade in the beginning, once you actually work through your grief, they can really be true for you. So I think that really speaks to this whole conversation that we had. So, as usual, this took a little more time than I expected, but I hope that you benefited from it in some way. And that's all that we covered. We didn't even get that into the resistance and spirituality this time around. And so I expected that might come up in October during the meeting, and moving into other aspects of grief, and perhaps starting to talk about sort of some tips for working, or I should say for being a man who is grieving. Again, thank you for viewing this. I hope it was helpful. I hope that you will consider joining us if you can. My email address is my first initial and last name at hom.org, HOM for Hospice of Michigan. So that's W Lawton, WLAWTON at HOM.org. I can support you in your grief however you might need. And specifically, I'd be happy to connect you with our Men Overcoming Loss group. Thanks again.